Hi there, and welcome to episode 2 of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. I'm Philip Ideson, and I'm joined by my co-host, Fine-Tune CEO Rich Ham, and my partner at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. So Rich and Kelly, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Kelly.
Glad to be back.
Now, we talked a little bit in episode 1, just kind of setting up the thesis of the opportunity that exists for procurement as we think about what we can achieve, what the impact that we can have within an organization, but also how the incentive structures for procurement may be hamstring a little bit about what we can do and lead to some behaviors which may not be behaviors that are in the best interest of our organizations, but we do because they're in our own personal best interests from the way that we're incentivized. So in this episode, we're going to talk a lot more about kind of the flaws that we have observed over the years, working in procurement, working with procurement, and some of the behaviors that we've seen that perhaps are not the behaviors that we want to exhibit if we think about how we can be the best partner for all of our stakeholders, internal and external. So some of the things we're going to talk about throughout the series and in today's episode, it might be a little bit uncomfortable for us to hear and reflect on. But I mean, I think that we're all in procurement. We're just doing the things we're incented on. It's not because we're doing anything that's wrong or that it reflects us what we do personally. It's just we're in this system that drives certain behaviors and we're reacting to that. So I wanted to say as we start that we're really trying to figure out. Okay, let's do that deep dive into what the flaws are so we can figure out, what might be the best way of fixing it and give us that baseline from which to start with. The other thing that I think it's important to say is that, it's very easy to get to talk about procurement should do this and procurement should do that without really recognizing what the day-to-day life of a procurement professional is. And so we certainly, as we go through this series, going to be keeping that at the forefront of our mind is sometimes we just have to be pragmatic as procurement and do the things that we need to do to get the job done. And so it's important not to lose sight of that and not just be, very idealistic in terms of, well, we should do these things and we should do these other things when sometimes that might not be, possible to go and do those things. So we're going to be talking about that as well as we go through this series. But as we kind of kick off the, kind of taking that self-reflection into some of the flaws in the system, Rich, I know you've seen probably everything there is to see, but why don't you share a story or two around some of those flaws that we're trying to kind of uncover, unpack, and think, is there a better way?
I will, Phil. And I have worked with thousands of people in procurement over the last 20 or quarter century almost by now, and there are a few anecdotes that I think of that kind of put the subject matter of this project on full display, and I'll share one with you right off the bat. I'm going back about 15 years now, so we were still, Fine-Tune was only 7 or 8 years old at this point, still a relative startup. And I found myself in a sales process with a large food processor, and we were focused on just a couple of niche indirect services at this point: the uniform rental industry and the waste and recycling industry, two kind of notoriously difficult expenses to manage. And I found myself. I was a little late to the game for this opportunity from our perspective, and for your listeners, we sell a contingency-based service. Hey, but we're one of those firms that says, "Hey, buddy, I'll save you some money on X if you'll share the savings with us," as a general rule. And back in those days, that's really all we were. We've kind of diversified from there at this point. But so I was trying to get a shared savings deal in place to target a couple of indirect services for this large food processor. And I say I was a little late to the game for this opportunity because the category manager who owned this very large national uniform program was about to sign a new deal, okay? And he had already told his boss, his peers, his department, the key stakeholders, that the deal he was about to sign was a 40% cost savings against his current run rate. So obviously he's promising a big win. And I say to him, it's really my only play at this point. I say, hey, well, you're about to make a 5-year commitment. Don't you at least want to make sure it is what you think it is, A, and B, it's as good as it could be? And what I recommended, I said, let's sign a confidentiality agreement and let me look at some data, and I'll report back to you. I'll tell you if it is what you think it is, and if it's not, perhaps I'll propose a way forward so that I can help you. And he agrees, and so he floods me with information, and the data comes to me, and he's just wrong. 40% wasn't ever going to be 40%. It was 15 at best. In reality, the supplier, when they went to key in the new account, it's a highly complex account, I would put the over-under at 10% at most is what hits the P&L in month 1 of that new deal. There were some poison pills in the contract that the buyer didn't understand. 10 was going to erode rapidly by the end of year 1. I suspect he would have been back to his original run rate, if not almost there. By the end of year 2, he's upside down 8 to 12%, and so on. And so I had a relationship with, there was another guy in the department that I knew, and one of the peers of this category manager. And I called this peer, who I had a friendly relationship with, and I said, hey Jeff, this deal that your partner is about to sign over there that he's told everybody is 40%. It's not. It's not even close to that, and it's gonna you'll be backwards from your starting point within 2 years. And my question to him was, that's surely going to be bad, right? And he said, my guess is nobody will ever notice. Mm-hmm. And I said, and I'm still learning about how the procurement departments and professionals are incentivized and measured at this point. So I'm genuinely asking out of curiosity. I say, well, hold on. I said, when we'll call the buyer Bob. When does Bob get rewarded or credited with this initiative? And he said, it'll probably at the time the contract gets signed. It might even be a little before that even. He said there's going to be a meeting where he kind of presents his analysis, his deal analysis to either a VP, might be a CPO, maybe there's a finance person in the room. But, when that analysis gets presented, it'll either be right then or shortly thereafter when the new deal gets executed, and the credit will be doled out at that point. It will count towards his numbers. And I'm like, wait, hold on. He'll get the credit before the first dime of savings hits the P&L, before the results of his initiative even appear on a single invoice? And he says, yeah. And I said, well, okay, so is it really not bad in any way, shape, or form for Bob if what he's told everybody is 40% really is nothing near that, and by the time 3.5, 4 years later, he's 20 to 30% above his starting point because this vendor has capitalized to the tune of 8 to 12% annual increases throughout this 5-year agreement? Is there really nothing bad about that for Bob? And the answer was, no, it'll probably even be a good thing for him, because if he's still in that role, he can do it all over again 4 or 5 years later. And my head exploded, and I had to piece, my head and brains all back together. And it's really a survival story, though. Here I am with you to discuss it today. But yes, I thought it was preposterously stupid. And yet, I had just assumed that, well, surely all they want is to find optimal and stay there. And in this case, I have a guy from the procurement department at a very large food processor telling me, no, it'll actually be a good thing if this initiative backfires and doesn't work, because then we can do it again. Wow. Phil, Kelly, let me pause there for a moment. Is there anything about that story that surprises you? Let's go to Kelly here first with this one. As you hear me tell that story, are you shocked, appalled? Do you not believe me because it's so far-fetched? or do you go, I can actually see that, yeah.
So there is one piece that shocks me. The piece that shocks me is that Bob, and I don't know if we named him, but Bob's friend, said the quiet part out loud. I think that's the only part that surprised me. They admitted that Bob was probably going to be rewarded in advance of any of the ink being dry, and also knowing that it probably wasn't going to play out to that 40% that they were talking about in the first place. I think generally as we've said, we do the best inside of the system that we find ourselves in. And so, no, I'm not shocked that this is how it went. I'm not shocked that the news was overly rosy. I'm not shocked that there probably wasn't going to be a realistic revision that anybody was going to be paying attention to over the life of the contract. And of course, Bob, being a good procurement professional, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever the contract is, of course he's going to come in and do a really good job renegotiating that contract, because that's what the system we're working inside of is designed to make us do. But I think, the only piece surprises me is that they were willing to admit to how it is actually going to work up front.
He was an especially candid guy who had, and this guy was he'd probably been in the profession for 25 years, 30 years at this point. And so he was willing to just kind of let it fly, and he'd roll his eyes and realize that what he was saying was, didn't sound smart, but he just was kind of like, yeah, that's what happens. That's how it goes. Phil, what was your reaction? Did the story surprise you in any way?
No, of course not. That's I think back to the beginning of my career, and how I was initially taught procurement and the culture around procurement, the environments that I was in. There was a lot of focus on gaming the system. Gaming the system means, we were in, our metric was 3% year-on-year savings, which it was in those days in the portfolio of spend that I had, then you don't want to save too much over your 3% either. Like if there's an opportunity to save more over your 3%, you're going to have a savings target the year after of another 3%. So you're kind of figuring out, okay, how can I delay savings as well? So it's not even taking, bigger savings up front. And you would see examples of where people would go and get those big savings in year one or claim the big savings in year one before anything had ever materialized. They got promotions based on the fact that they'd got this big deal in that had got a big savings in year one. But we'd also look on the other side of how can I make sure I don't save too much money in year one? And so that may be delaying a new contract start into the next year so that you can claim it in the next year so that you're more confident you're going to get your 3% next year.
Yeah.
And there's just lots of games that were kind of played around just, gaming the system to make sure that you hit those savings targets on a year over year perspective. I
have seen these movies, and the audience score is low. Not great movies. Let's name the flaws if we could before we move on, because I think it's worth kind of giving them a name or a tagline, if you will. In that one story that I told, I think I counted 3 separate flaws that are worthy of note in this whole conversation. Okay, number 1, I'm going to call this one credit before results. It's like we decide what the value of an initiative is before it actually happens. And gosh, there's a hell of a lot of potential flies in that ointment alone. First and foremost, what if the deal analysis is just wrong? Mm-hmm. What if it's based on a supplier proposal that intentionally kind of presented the proposal in ways that were, more favorable than it actually was? That, how often can you believe a supplier when they tell you, hey, here's my proposal, it's a 40% savings? Of course you can't. You have to look at what's in the agreement and the pricing exhibit and all the language, and you have to analyze it to determine what it really is. So crediting an initiative before the results actually manifest in the P&L is, of course, flawed. And I think one of the common threads we'll be talking about throughout this project is the negotiation execution gap. We all understand that, anytime you sign a contract, you can't just declare the moment you signed it what the future of that expense that's governed by that contract is. You know that things change. You know that the way business evolves and changes, where the landscape changes, where your needs evolve over the course of that agreement will in part determine the spend and will in part, change the value of the initiative. Sometimes for the better, by the way, but other times for the worse. And so credit before results, I think, is a key flaw that we'll talk about. There's a corollary to that flaw, though, that I think is key to notice or to note, which is because we have a system that offers credit before results, you don't need validation. Why would you? You declared the results when the deal was signed, so you don't have to validate. You don't have to go back in and prove that it happened. You already declared that it happened. You declared on the front end. It was 40% savings. I have made this reality. At 40% savings, I got the credit. It went towards my numbers, and next year's a new year, and that's a distant memory. Who cares what happened? I was told by a guy at a Global 100 business a while back who was a director-level procurement executive. He said, he's talking about leaned out resources in these days and how they can't engage in any sort of expense management whatsoever post-deal. And he said, he used a great phrase. He goes, all we can do is lob contracts over the wall and hope for the best. Mm-hmm. And so part of this, of course, I think there's like another thread related to this, especially related to the validation flaw, which is bandwidth constraints. A department that once played a more activist role in managing expenses now doesn't have the bandwidth to do that. Okay, so that'll be another interesting thread. But let's stay with the flaws here. Flaw number 3 that I heard just in that story alone, counting only the good. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. Most procurement practitioners, imagine you're a category manager who owns 10 categories that total up to $200 million a year, okay? And let's say your annual goal, you're supposed to document 5% savings initiatives across your $200 million. So you got to find $10 million in savings per year. And as I said, you own 10 categories. Let's say each of those categories are $20 million a year. You're not going to make your 10 generally via initiatives from all 10 categories. You're probably going to work on 3 or 4 in a given year and cobble together your quota, your number that you're trying to work towards. If the other 6 categories, 7 categories, whatever it was you weren't working on actively during that year, are escalating at 8 to 12%, as we talked about in that story, at 3 times inflation, at 3 times allowable increases, at 3 times CPI-based increases throughout those years, I don't see where category managers are held accountable for that whatsoever. It just doesn't tend to be. And maybe there are exceptions out there, and would love to hear from listeners who say, no, actually, my organization's really forward-thinking. We are actually penalized for the bad things that happen under our watch. But as a general rule, I don't think there's much of that. I think, procurement departments, the ways that they're incentivized tends to count only the good things that happen. And I had a funny conversation the other day with my CFO. We were talking about this exact phenomenon. And we said, imagine a decade-long supplier-buyer relationship. And imagine that there was a category that involved 5-year contracts, okay? So there were 2 years in this 10-year relationship where, and we'll call him Bob again, where Bob goes in and negotiates, let's say 10% savings twice. And let's even give him credit. It actually hits the P&L and sticks. But in the other 8 years, the supplier successfully drives spend up 8 to 12% per year. Liken it to a boxing match. It's a 10-round fight. Who won? Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, any objective observer would say it's a unanimous decision. The seller won. The supplier won. They in the joust over the actual money that was taking place here. It was a butt kicking. It wasn't even close. The seller won, and the scorecards would all be the same. The procurement department, I think in many cases the scorecard would say we're 2-0, or even better yet, what's the story? Caption this picture. The caption would be 20% savings. Mm-hmm. What's your reaction to all that? Because I will admit I find it preposterous, and yet I see it everywhere.
So I took a couple of notes down as you were talking. One is that with different savings methodologies, this goes to claiming up front what your savings are at the end. Often the governance doesn't necessarily exist to stop a procurement professional from picking the savings methodology that will deliver the most value on paper for procurement. So that's sometimes a challenge unless you've got a good structure around how you actually set savings methodologies at the beginning of a project, how you make sure those are aligned with the needs of a stakeholder, how you get finance to validate them. There's lots of things you can do from a governance perspective, but in a lot of organizations, that structure doesn't exist. So that's one of the issues that we see. Mm-hmm. You talked about the good and the bad. I think one of the challenges for procurement is they don't necessarily know what a market price for something should be, for example. So you're not necessarily measuring, if you don't know what the bad is, then if there's a gap between what you've negotiated and what you should have negotiated, you don't actually have the expertise to know what it should have been. So you don't really everything that you see is everything that you're reporting on is only the good because that's the only things that you know about. Yeah. And there's we've lots of stories of, well, you saved $5 million. It was $5 million spend. You negotiated to $4 million. You celebrate the $1 million in savings, but actually it should have been 2.5.
Yeah. I think one of the things you're pointing to, Phil, is validation and real immersement in the joust that is expense management, the fight over money with between buyers and sellers, which, by the way, is a healthy fight that we all benefit from as consumers. When buyers and sellers are competing in that healthy way, it forces sellers and widget makers and service providers to find ways to be efficient, which ultimately benefits the consumer. And so we should want for this joust to exist. We should want for it to be healthy. We should want for it to work. And yet, I think, when we have systems that have been set up probably with the best of intentions, but that allow a losing party, in the example I gave, to claim victory, it starves the system of the friction that it wants, that to be a more healthy system. That when the incentive is stripped away to engage in the joust over the money, the pressure isn't really placed on the suppliers to find new efficiencies. They just go, oh, well, I'll just put what I need to put in the contract to win the business, and then I'll make exactly as much money as I want thereafter, because they're not managing me. They're not validating this.
That's because the suppliers are skilled in being able to do that.
Yes.
And to understand where in the system that they can find revenue, beyond a contract being signed. And you talked about bandwidth. I think that is a challenge for procurement, is that we do often, go to the time of, like, I often ask procurement leaders when I'm trying to understand the maturity of the organization, for example, and maturity not necessarily being, how advanced they are in what they do as individuals, but just the depth and the breadth of their impact, and it's, are you involved in contract management post signature? And yes, that's a resources game. But if you're just churning out RFPs and getting to sign a contract, and then, as you said, kind of someone had referred to you as throwing it over the fence and hoping for the best, then those suppliers are really skilled in taking advantage of that. And that's where it all goes back to the perception of procurement, is that if you're going and saying, I saved this much money, and the CFO is saying, I don't see that, then we have this problem of savings as our only metric, when we can't necessarily show that the savings are being achieved. And that's where we come into difficulty in getting further investment in the profession, and getting the trust of the CFO, for example. All comes down to it all impacts the same thing, which finds itself in that position of, how can we get more money for procurement? Well, we have to be more trusted, and therefore, we have to be able to do a better job of showing that what we've claimed to have achieved has actually been achieved.
Yeah, indeed. Phil, while that story did illustrate, the three flaws that I just named, I don't think it's an exhaustive list of all the flaws that we've talked about. And there's one that we just have to hit here in this episode, because it's so pervasive, it's so commonplace, and I would argue it does so much damage. And that is that these plans tend to revolve so heavily around this magical, but if we really pause and think about it, rather arbitrary increment of 365 days. Oh, the year, a year, the magical increment of time where nothing else matters after that year. And so, I think that because the mindset of year-over-year measurement and year-over-year improvement has become so pervasive, there have been some really significant unintended consequences. And let's face it, that part of what we're talking about here is the way that this particular mindset has even infiltrated the way departments define critical terms like savings.
Yep.
It's made its way into the definition of the term. That, like, savings means the impact of initiative X for the next 365 days. But thereafter,
Doesn't matter.
doesn't matter. It doesn't count. And so, but of course, some expenses are multi-year propositions. In some expenses, you can do things to set the business up for success over 3, 4, 5 years. But if you're not being incentivized to do so, and in fact, if we hearken back to the original story I shared, if you actually benefit from the steps backwards, from the from the cost escalations, because they'll create the low-hanging fruit for your next initiative a few years back, and you're not going to be punished or penalized for the escalations well in excess of what would have been attainable, then of course you're going to have unhealthy results. There's a couple stories that I want to share here because I think they really highlight we're doing a kind of a Tales of Dysfunction episode here. And so let's just go ahead and
Share some dysfunction.
Yes. And so we will of course keep these anonymous, but there was a client I had years back who my team had done some great work and they had gained agreement from this client's pest control supplier to issue a really large refund check. It was $750,000 refund check for pest control, for crying out loud. And it was just for years of blatant overcharging that we had uncovered. Okay. And we're so excited to report to our client contact that we've got this great news. Like, holy cow, they're going to scratch you a check. They've agreed to it. Where should we send it? Where should we send the check? That's the only question. And my client goes, actually go back to him and tell him that what I'd rather get is I want $250,000 this year, $250,000 next year, and $250,000 the year after. I don't want it all now. The client didn't even ask for interest, just gave the supplier a free loan on that money. And the reason was, of course, this person wanted to make their numbers in each of the next 3 years. There were also weird other factors there. This particular company they correlated spend under management with departmental headcount, which sounds like it makes sense on its face. Oh, for $100 million in spend, you need X number of people, but for $20 billion in spend, you need Y. Except for one problem, the thought process had infiltrated this whole department that you don't want to save too much money, because then they'll be coming for heads.
We've got less spend to manage.
Yeah. So there were two separate kind of totally dysfunctional flaws playing out in the same story. This is, the year over year measurement of everything. And as opposed to we think of our household expenses as existing on a continuum, right? When I refinanced a mortgage a few years back in 2016, it was like, I came home and I was like, whoa, awesome, 20 years of savings. I didn't think 1 year of savings and 19 years of cost avoidance. It was the money for 20 years, okay? And so, anyway, I think, Kelly, was there anything about those stories that surprised you? I want to come back to you again. No, I want that money over 3 years and the whole correlation of headcount and spend under management.
Well, I'm also going to go way out on a limb and suggest that maybe this person that was in charge of pest control didn't want to have this flood of $750,000 worth of evidence that they hadn't been watching the supplier until your team showed up. Okay, that's probably not. On the one hand, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is, here's $750,000. The bad news is, because of me, you didn't have this for many years up to that point. I think in all of it, some of this is incentives within the procurement system. Some of it is human beings doing human being things in response to the things that we encounter. And so I think, yes, we can, through this series, although I'm increasingly suspicious that Bob may be the core problem in all of this. It only took us 2 episodes instead of 24. Thinking maybe if we just move Bob along, all of this will clear up. Bob, I know. But I think, yes, there are the procurement incentives that have to be talked about and corrected, but those incentives don't exist in a vacuum. They're existing inside larger incentives and nested incentives and conflicting incentives. And so all of this conversation, some of it's procurement, some of it's human, and some of it's much larger. But I think everybody listening in or watching probably has some story where they experience something similar, or where you instinctively react, right, I don't want to have to go admit that this $750,000 mistake was on my watch. That's probably a good sign you're listening to the right podcast series, because it means you can relate exactly to the very real challenges that we're talking about.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, and I can think of many examples that I won't necessarily go into, but of where it made sense because of the incentive structure to do the same. You know, whether it's taking 3% savings every year over a 3-year contract rather than 9% savings up front.
Yeah. Oh, seen it a million times. Yes.
Yeah, because if your new baseline is 3% lower, then I'm going to take another 3% off my new baseline the next year. That would be a pretty common thing that I encountered. Probably more on the direct materials side than the services side, but that's just because that was my purview at the time when I saw a lot of these actions.
Well, I think going back to Kelly's comments, she's right that this is also a story in part about human behavior. Mm-hmm. I love that in our intro we quote Charlie Munger, who said, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome."
Yep.
And so, yes, humans generally act in their own interest, and it's the challenge. It's incumbent upon business leaders to make sure that they have aligned the systems of incentive that are in place with the desired outcomes. And I think part of what we'll also explore here is it possible that since the systems were put in place, the world has changed in ways, the business world has changed, the dynamics between buyer and seller have changed in ways that have made what might have been relatively minor flaws at first more and more and more grand scale flaws, to where now it's really critical that we re-examine the ways that we're doing things because the harms are greater than they've ever been and they keep getting worse. I think that's going to be a thread that we're going to talk about going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely the case. You think about the processes, procedures, tools, all those things that we use that are now kind of common practice in procurement were probably not invented, but kind of popularized in the mid-90s. So we're dealing with processes and approaches that are at this point 25, 30 years old. And obviously a very different time, very different economic environment. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say that the world has obviously changed, and the way that we work with our suppliers has changed, and the balance of power has changed, and all those things. And perhaps our processes and the way that we measure success haven't changed, with those times.
Yeah, well said. I think we're probably coming to the end of this second episode, but a couple of things you just said, and I'm going to give a little teaser to our listeners, because a few episodes down the road, we're going to spend a little time talking about how we got here. Mm-hmm. And by the way, this is another area where we want to invite help from the listeners. Introduce us to your procurement industry academics who know, the professors of procurement history who know how we got to where we are, and where along the way, whether it was finance or big consulting that played roles in kind of driving these strictures into place. But I'm excited for, I think it's the 6th episode of the series. We're going to be talking to Rob Hills, a retired partner from Deloitte who ran supply chain at Deloitte. And I know he's going to have some really interesting perspectives, historical perspectives on some of the things you were just saying, Phil.
Yeah, and I think part of the journey with this series is looking beyond savings, but we're never going to get away from the fact that savings is probably, for most organizations, going to be the number one thing that they're measured on. So making sure that, the savings that we are measured on, how do we make sure that they're real and that they drop to the bottom line, and that they're that we are given credit for the savings that we've been able to achieve. And that'll be a big part of it, but also exploring other areas where we can drive value, and how can we get measured for that value. I think all the time about one of the challenges that we have that we're all trying to overcome in procurement is the fact that we really professionalized procurement and made the business case for investment in procurement over probably the last 20 years based on the ROI of savings. And so we've kind of created this environment where we have told everybody the way to measure us is by how much money we save. And therefore, that's the only thing we know of in terms of how we can share, this is what we've done, this is how we've achieved success. And there are so many other ways that we can generate value for the businesses we're going to be exploring in the series.
Yeah.
And so part of it is, how do we move away from, it's on us to do that, because we've told the organization by way of the business case that we made for investment in procurement that savings is the only thing to measure us on. And that's something that we as procurement, and only we as procurement, can kind of change from an external, from how people judge us, but also how people in the organization look to invest in us.
Two quick observations on that. One, when I think back on the anecdote I shared with the food processor and the guy who, signed a deal, told everybody it was going to be 40%. It wasn't anywhere near, and the company went backward from there, which he, by the way, did go ahead and sign the deal. And it played out exactly as his peer predicted. I think that is an example of such purposeless behavior. It's the opposite of purposeful procurement. I even had a client once tell me years ago, he said, "Oh, well, it's just funny money anyway." Yeah, sure, I'm making these projections and claiming savings, but he used the phrase, "It's just funny money." But I think that if we do what you're suggesting and find ways to ensure that the outputs of procurement are more real than they are today, already you're advancing in the direction of more purpose, right? That would feel more purposeful to me if I were in the profession. But then, and I think we're going to talk to some fascinating people who will share insights in how the very same flaws that we're talking about as they relate to ownership-minded behavior, P&L-minded behavior, are also hindrances to a vast universe of potential for procurement to achieve that goes beyond the P&L, beyond the company's walls, whether it's sustainability, whether it's social impact, or other forms of value creation that can emerge from procurement. I think we're going to find, by talking to some experts along the way here, that the same flaws in the system we discussed today are actually also barriers to procurement reaching its potential in those other areas. And I'm really excited for that part of the research project, if you will.
Well, before we wrap up, Kelly, I just want to come to you last time for any final thoughts that you may have on the discussion today, and obviously what's coming up later in the series.
Well, and I do think it's important to remember that purpose, right? Because we didn't all choose to go into procurement, right, Phil? That's your trademark.
Yep.
Did you find procurement,
Yep.
or did procurement find you? But most people genuinely love being in the field once they find it. And so remembering that initial excitement, remembering the impact that we can have on the whole company, the businesses we work with, the communities that we impact, I think it's admitting the flaws, but then looking towards the opportunities. Hopefully we've gotten across that piece of the story today, because there are definitely going to be some uncomfortable things we have to face in getting through this, but it is so worth it because of all of the different forms of value well beyond savings that really only procurement has the potential to negotiate and then deliver for the company.
And the good news is we're going to pivot in our next episode from, we've talked about a little bit about dysfunction today, but we're going to be talking with Oliver Hurry, who's really one of the world's foremost experts in purposeful business and purposeful procurement. So we're going to start our journey of really being inspired about the art of the possible. So I'm looking forward to our next conversation, episode 3 with Oliver.
I can't wait for this conversation, Phil. Ali, full disclosure, is a friend of mine, but he is fabulously insightful as it relates to procurement with purpose, and some of the work he's doing in sustainability and decarbonization is inspiring and provides listeners with an example of just how unlimited the potential is for procurement to add value both within a company's walls and without.